Hello again. In this presentation, I'm going to introduce the steps of the impact assessment process. The purpose of our session is to explain the steps of the impact assessment process and discuss what are the impacts and benefits that might result from small hydropower projects. So, the environmental and social impact assessment process identifies the future consequences of a proposed or correct action, integrating the socioeconomic, the cultural, and human effects that might result from the project. It looks not only at direct impacts or effects, but also the indirect ones. Impact assessment as a tool for sustainable development has different objectives. One of them is to protect the productivity and capacity of the natural systems so they continue providing services for mankind. The other, and more important in the regulatory aspect, is to integrate environmental and social considerations in decisions about projects. With this, impact assessment is a tool to anticipate and eventually try to minimize or avoid, if possible, the significant negative effects on the biophysical, the social, or other components of the environment. And these together will contribute to promote sustainable development by knowing the trade-offs among these different areas and then see how can minimize these trade-offs. Impact assessment is more or less consented worldwide, and that means that in most countries, all the evaluations of impact assessment will have the same steps, sometimes called differently, but the process that is followed is the same. We start by the screening, which is just to determine if an impact assessment is needed based on the type of project. The regulation might specify some exemptions, for example, because of size, or might require some assessment even for small projects if, for instance, they are located within protected areas. So the main question during the screening is if an impact assessment is required for the specific project. The next step is scoping, and that is when the content of the impact assessment is decided. For that, there are different steps that involve, for example, know the characteristics of the project, the location, what elements of the environment might be affected, but also to consider the concerns of people or other authorities. Sometimes within the scoping, or sometimes as an additional step, it is required to analyze alternatives for the project. And these are in which other ways it could be possible to implement that project, or in which other ways could be possible to satisfy the need that give motivation for the project. Once there is a preliminary identification of impacts that need to be included in the scoping, the next step is the analysis of impacts. And the purpose of this step is to determine what are the impacts that are expected in more detail, but also which ones are negative and significant. In some countries, there is the need to consider all the significant negative impacts, but in some countries, it might be the emphasis to focus on the most significant ones. And this is one area that still has not been standardized, so is subjected to variations among the countries. All these steps are together an iterative process. That means that we don't step one step in and continue with the other and forget about what we did before, but means that we are adjusting all through the process, because it might be even after we are identifying mitigations that we might see that maybe there is only one way to mitigate a specific impact, but that mitigation also has other impacts, so we need to include them back in the analysis. And so after we have determined the significance, the next step is mitigation and management. And that means that we have identified what impacts are negative. So we need to think, what are we going to do now about those impacts? Ideally, we will try to find ways to avoid those impacts from happening, but if that is not possible, then we will have to mitigate them. And then the next step is to produce the environmental impact assessment report. In most countries, there are different types of assessments depending on the complexity of the project and the severity of impacts that are expected it might have. In some cases, there might be just like a screening assessment if the project doesn't have too many significant impacts and is not affecting a large area. That would be what is needed for the decision. But if we have a large project, then it might need a more detailed or comprehensive assessment. So most small hydropower projects could follow probably a screening report or a not very detailed environmental assessment depending on the regulations. Even in some countries, there are some hydropower projects, small ones, that might be exempted just because of the size. But assuming that these projects require an environmental assessment, after we have analyzed the impacts and identified the mitigations, the next step is to report. And that is to put in a document the analysis that we have done and to communicate to all those interested our findings. So does the impact have, the project has significant impacts? Which ones? And then how can those impacts be mitigated? This report then is submitted to authorities and sometimes also to the public, and that's what the yellow star signifies here, for reviewing before a decision is made. The regulations about public participation vary among countries. In some countries, the public participates in the final decision of the project. For example, in Bhutan or even in Canada. In other countries, it's mainly the authority who reviews the report and then issues a decision. And then after the decision is made, the next step is to implement the project and to follow up on those mitigations for the impacts that were identified before. So in this diagram, the green arrow indicates the steps in which it's common to have public participation. And I included also in impact analysis because people that live in the area where a project is going to be implemented have lots of knowledge, traditional and local, about the environment there. So they are a good source of information. But also they are those that would be benefited or affected by the projects. Also, they need to be consulted about that. And that's also one of the steps of the impact assessment. So in this presentation, I'm going to follow the first steps of two impact analysis. In the next presentation, I will cover the other steps. So talking in more detail, so screening, remember, is to decide if an impact assessment is needed. And I mentioned before that depending on the size, some projects might be excluded, especially, for example, micro projects might be excluded. In some cases, also small hydropowers could be excluded. So what is excluded and what not usually is indicated in the legislation. Most acts or statutes or regulations will have a list of projects that are required to have an assessment or projects that are exempted. So for that, I suggest that you check, if you have not done that, check the legislation in your country to see what are the requirements for hydropower projects. But besides this prescriptive approach, I mean, to follow what is specified in laws, the other approach is discretionary. And that means that all the ministries of the environment have the power to decide or to require an environmental assessment, even if it's not indicated in the regulations. And that might be because of the sensitivity of the place or because of public concerns. So the scoping, and remembering that is the phase of the assessment in which it will be decided what will be studied, uh, requires some basic information on the project. Uh, the size, the location, what kind of technology, what activities and works will be involved in the construction, then on the operation during the whole life of this project, from planning to the commission. And usually the assessment will be divided in different phases. The first one is the construction, what impacts will happen there. Then the second is the operation. And the last one is the decommission or end of life. Also, in not many cases is this last phase included. When the authority receives the request to approve a project that still doesn't have an environmental assessment, it will usually prepare the terms of reference for the assessment. And those are the content, minimum content that the authority expects to have in that impact assessment report. And this scoping needs to consider also the baseline. So what are the issues or concerns that need to be included in the assessment? And if there had been public participation, it will incorporate those concerns that were received when the terms of reference are made public. That is the case of Canada, for example, where the authorities need to announce that a new project is going to request environmental assessment, and the authority produces the terms of references. They are available on the portal of the environmental assessment or of the proponent. Then the public can comment on those terms of reference, and the proponent need to integrate those comments in the assessment. An important part of the scoping is to determine what are the boundaries for the assessment. And those are not only spatial boundaries, but also temporal boundaries. So how far in the future and sometimes how far in the past this assessment needs to identify impacts. Then needs to consider what other information is needed for decision making. And then once we have the scoping, we can go to the next step. But before that, I want just to illustrate the. Let's talk about the boundaries. As I mentioned before, there are two types. The first time are the spatial boundaries, and the second, the temporal ones. There are different components of the environment that might be affected, and all of them react in different ways. Also, all of them have different needs, especially the biological and social components. So if we think on how the project affects its environment, we have different zones. The area where the project is located is the footprint of the project. Then we have around a direct zone of influence, in this case, the yellow area. This is where the effects of the project will be experienced with more intensity, and also the benefits of the project. Then we have an indirect zone of influence. There, the impacts might be minor or barely noticed. And then we have a larger area that for some projects might be also important, which is the transboundary. And we have, for example, development in rivers that are shared between different provinces or even different countries. So each one of the components, animals and plants, move in different ways and use different parts of the environment. And those are represented here by the different lines. If we think, for example, uh, I think on mammals, for example, the red line might be a small mammal that has a small area where it lives, is nice, is a habitat range. But if we think in a larger mammal, if we were thinking, for example, in Africa, if we have giraffes or elephants, those move across larger areas of the environment, so their habitat could be much larger. That means that for impact assessment, to analyze the spatial boundaries, often we will have to deal with different boundaries according to the components that might be affected. Temporal, also we need to consider different boundaries. And I put here past and present because in some cases, the activities that have happened before might interact with the activities that will occur later and can create other synergistic effects. Then, talking about the future, we need to consider what will happen during the construction, but also the operation and the commission, because some of the impacts might be short term, but some impacts might be long term. So, what goes in the baseline? So, we mentioned that impacts are those changes that the project brings to the environment, and for that, we need to know what is there at the beginning. So, that is the baseline. And the baseline usually is divided in some specific larger components, which is the physical environment that involves the soil, or the geology, or the landscape, chemical characteristics of water, land, or air, uh, biological components that refer to all life, all biodiversity, included endangered species, social components that include the communities in the area of influence of the project, but also groups that have special needs or that value the environment in a way that is different from the rest of the population. And that those are, for example, ethnic minorities. Social aspects also include cultural impacts, could be related to archaeological values or spiritual values of the landscape or elements of the environment. Another component is the workers. So in the assessment, it's important to determine to what risks the workers will be exposed, to then propose mitigations to ensure their safety. Projects also can benefit the economy at different scales from local to even national, but also can have some negative impacts on, for instance, the local economy if there could be displacement of some people or they cannot access resources. And last component that needs to be assessed is related to risks, accidents, and malfunctions. And this uh, is to complement because in all the previous ones, we are looking at the effects of the project on the environment. But in this one, especially, we are looking at the effects of the environment on the project. Because the location where the particular project might be located could be affected by floods or earthquakes or even accidents, but in some cases also could be object of violence, for instance, for terrorism. So it's important to consider those aspects to ensure that the project will live for the time that it has been planned. So when we look at alternatives, is to think in which other ways could this project be made more sustainable. In some cases, it might be radical, for example, by choosing a different location to avoid some areas that might be sensitive, or to avoid impacts, for instance, in a part of a river that might be important for um, the reproduction of fish or some other species of economic or cultural or biological importance. So the alternatives can be in different ways. Also can be in the selection of the technology that could be used. For instance, the type of turbine or what type of project could be it. For instance, it could be a run-of-the-river project, or it could be a diversion. That could be also an alternative to analyze. So the dimensions, but in some cases, it also can be on scheduling the works or activities. That could be one way to reduce impacts. For example, in rivers where fish migrate to reproduce in a certain season, the constructions should avoid uh, uh, activities in that season to not interfere with the migration of fish. Also, for alternatives, it's important to consider the knowledge of people. Sometimes they might know locations that could be more appropriate. Um, in some countries, the assessment of alternatives also requires to analyze the no-go option. That is, what would happen if the project is not approved or is not implemented. That is also considered an alternative. But in this case, for that no-go alternative, also it's important to determine what would be the future, will the future evolve in the absence of that project. So that means that it's not the same as keeping the environment, the baseline as it is, because over time, changes happen. So for hydropower projects, also alternatives might be, again, changes on the design, on the layout, on the size, or on the operational conditions. So alternatives could be also whether how the water will be conducted to the turbines. Then the next step is impact analysis. So, and what do we do in this step? So here is where we determine the types of impacts that would be expected, but also try to quantify them as best as possible. In impact analysis, we are predicting or estimating what will happen. That means that we use the best available knowledge that we have, the best methods that we have, but still we are not looking at the future. We are trying to estimate what we'll have, so we might have some uncertainty or some errors that we need to disclose when we are conducting the assessment. A key activity or skill to have during the impact analysis is to understand these interactions that happen among the different parts of the environment, let's say people and the environment, or wildlife and their environment, and then decide how those interactions might be changed by the project. The impact analysis will follow what is specified in the terms of reference, but is always required to integrate new impacts that are identified as the impacts as the assessment process is progressing. That means we don't restrict ourselves to what the authority says, but we do our best to capture all impacts that could happen and then decide which ones are significant or not. Here, I'm not talking about the specific methods or techniques to analyze impacts in specific components of the environment because those are very extensive. Uh, but first, by knowing during the scoping what parts of the environment might be affected is what helps practitioners decide what impact methods are required, what expertise is needed in the team. For instance, sociologists or ethnologists, um, air quality specialists, hydrologists, um, biologists. So many different types of experts need to be involved in the assessment process. And all will know their specific tools and methods to use. And there could be a team or sometimes a person that will integrate the findings of these different methods in a way that it is showing how the project is affecting these different components. And we will see uh, some of the common method that is used for that. Talking about impacts, not all impacts are the same. We know what direct impacts are. So those result specifically from the interaction of one work or activity of the project with the environment. If we are going to build a small hydropower project and we are going to build a diversion, a direct impact could be, for example, the excavation to create the canal for the diversion, but also could be the temporal change on how the water is flowing into the river. So those could be examples of direct impacts. Indirect impacts result from the direct impacts. And for example, if we are um, digging or building this canal, an impact could be to disturb birds that live nearby because of the noise. And if they are in the reproductive season, then we might be contributing to mortality of the new generation. Or if we are diverting the water, an indirect impact might be that there is less water downstream, or that some of the organisms that live in the water suddenly don't have enough for their particular needs. And for example, for fish, might be that fish might temporarily disappear from parts of the river because of the diversion of water. So that would be an example of an indirect effect. Induced effects occur later on time. So from the moment that we have an impact until they are experienced, it will happen on usually over the course of months or sometimes years. For instance, if we are diverting water, and that is also resulting in a decrease in how the water flows or the amount of water in other parts of the river, and that is affecting the reproduction of fish. For example, on the long term, we could have a decrease on the population of fish, which could affect fishermen that depend on these resources. If by constructing the river, for example, we are blocking ways or improving roads, then maybe over time that improvement of roads might result in more people coming to the area and probably establishing there, so increasing the population and then also increasing the demand for water. So cumulative effects, that's a term that I want to emphasize because we will discuss it later, are those effects that result from the interaction of the impacts of the project when those impacts add to the impacts that other activities or other projects in the area are having. Uh, these cumulative effects also happen when we have, uh, as I mentioned before, many small projects that individually are considered not having impact, but when we put them all together, will contribute to a larger impact. So cumulative effects say occur with the interaction of past, present, and future projects or activities in the area. And for this, at the level of a project, we need to know how much the particular project is contributing to that. And I will cover this later. Transboundary impacts, I also mentioned before, are impacts that are experienced in other locations away from where the project is located. It might be in a different basin. For instance, if there is uh, some projects that contribute to emissions, of course, most hydropower projects will not worry about that. But in the other types of projects, we have effects from subbasins. When we have a significant capture of water in one part of a large basin, then that might result that overall downstream there could be effects on water availability. So why are cumulative effects important? Because initially it was considered that small hydropower developments didn't have the impacts of large hydropower developments. So many of them had proliferated in different parts of the world, in different river systems, and some of them are also excluded from a thorough assessment. But what happens here, for example, when we put them in perspective, we have different developments, and together they start to transform river systems. And in this case, environmental and social impact assessment for a project is not able to capture that multiplicity of projects that are occurring in one region. A better tool for that is the strategic environmental assessment that could look at this whole basin or region and then assess, for instance, how many rivers are there, how many have been transformed by hydropower projects, and how is that affecting at the regional level uh, the quality of water or the integrity of river systems. So just recently, around a few years ago, is uh, when practitioners and also researchers are starting to think on this cumulative effect that the small hydropower projects have. And this is an example from one river in Germany, where I was looking at small hydropower projects, and I found that in a small part of the Inn River in Germany, there are already many hydropower developments along this river. So what are some of the impacts that might happen? We are talking about changes in environmental flows, for example, in uh, the seasonality of the flows, but also on the amount of water that goes on the flows. But also, there are studies that have identified that by changing the velocity of the water that is released, many of these projects are also changing the geomorphology of the rivers and also the riverbed. And that means that for many species that depend on specific characteristics of riverbeds, the environment is changing. So that might make it more difficult for these species, especially native species, to um, live and reproduce properly and have good population levels, and might favor the presence of invasive species. And these are some of the impacts that have been reported in some areas. For example, this publication summarizes some um, effects that are happening in sensitive ecosystems in Turkey, and they specified that the higher of altitude, say the more on the mountains that the developments happen, the more impacts they have. And so they have identified this disruption or elimination of aquatic species, especially those that migrate upstream and downstream. Uh, Also, the mortality of fish by impacts with the turbines. In general, there has been uh, decreases in populations of wildlife species, but also the access that is created for these small projects favors the movement of people and favor some illegal activities, for example, illegal fishing or illegal hunting or illegal extraction of wood and other resources that contribute more to the degradation of the environment, and in some cases also uh, impact the same project because, for instance, if there is more deforestation, there will be more sedimentation going to the river, and that means more maintenance needs for uh, this particular development. Uh, One of the reasons why there are impacts on species is because not many countries and not all rivers, very few in fact, have assessments of environmental flows. And environmental flows are the amount of water in a specific amount and periodicity that needs to be available to keep maintaining a functioning river ecosystem. Because in many countries, there are no determinations of flows. The, the projects are approved and then the impacts are not considered. So what are some of the tools to determine the impacts? I mentioned before that the first thing that we need to do is to think on how the project is interacting with the environment and how the different components of the environment interact with each other and with the environment. Uh, some tool to do that is cause effect diagram. And this is an example. For instance, we think on what is coming out from the project and a specific activity or work, then what is resulting on it. For instance, if we are talking about excavation or drilling, and we can think that there is a release of sediment, then what happens when that sediment is released in the river? For instance, it will increase the turbidity in the water. It might um, change the dissolved compounds that are there. So it's increasing the quality of water. So this can have some effects. For example, for the human population, if there is no good water treatment and people take the water directly from the river, that means that they need to filter the water with more detail. Uh, and that, say, it's extra time for them, but also might represent, for instance, more time trying to get water for domestic purposes. If we talk about a river that is used for also recreational purposes, for example, in the Alps, Italian Alps, many of the rivers are used for kayaking. So when there is more sedimentation, the kayakers don't like to go to the river. Also, changes in the environmental flow affect the quality of the river for these recreational activities. And what happens that the local economy that depends on these recreationists also is affected. That could be an example of an indirect and also induced effect. So that is the first. So impact assessment is in principle thinking and common sense. Thinking on how the project is affecting the environment and what are the direct and indirect and long-term and cumulative consequences of those interactions. So I mentioned that there are different methods for the identification of impacts, uh, but in some cases, the guidance or the regulations might suggest some specific methods that should be used or tests that should be used, for instance, to determine water quality. What are the methods that are used at the level of the assessment? The manager of the assessment needs to ensure that there is a good coverage of all the different impacts that might happen, for instance, social, economic, uh, environmental, uh, to be sure that later when the project is reviewed, the decision makers will know exactly those trade-offs that happen between the impacts and benefits of the project. It's important to consider cumulative impacts. Also, in many countries, especially in developing countries, uh, these are not commonly assessed, but at the end, they contribute to the degradation of the environment. Um, Whenever possible, also compare the impacts and benefits of different alternatives to be sure that the project that is going to be approved is in fact the best alternative. Within the boundaries, we need to remember that we need to assess the impacts at different geographical levels, not only right where the project is located, but also as far as the impacts of the project could be experienced, and also depending on the components. So the main point, and for impact assessment practitioners, there is a code of ethics, and that is that, well, we need to be transparent and honest in how we assess or what methods we choose, but also we need to be unbiased, because that way uh, we really can contribute to sustainable development and not just to some interest groups. So there are different types of methods, and this is just an example, but for instance, analogs is if there is not too much information about a particular type of project, it's possible to use assessments in similar areas to get some of the impacts that are occurring and then try to assess them in the particular location where there is not much information. In some cases, there might be some checklists issued by the authorities, but checklists might list just to, for instance, a tool to identify that we are capturing all the different impacts. And on the financial aspect, cost-benefit analysis is a tool that is used, uh, especially to demonstrate the feasibility of the project, the financial feasibility. When we are in areas where there is not much information published, it's valid to ask experts for information to know how a particular project or activity could affect, for instance, a specific species or groups of people. Others on laboratory tests, but one of the main tools that is used, for instance, now is GIS for hydrology, hydrological models. There are different methods to estimate environmental flows. So the variety of methods is as diverse as the components that might be affected. But I just want to highlight from here again that uh, involving the stakeholders, the people that might be benefited or affected, is a best practice and a requirement in many countries. Unfortunately, not in many countries this is done properly. But if a project, especially small hydropower projects, will benefit some people, it's the best to inform these people, also to clarify expectations about the project. So I mentioned before that matrices are the tool that is used in impact assessment to synthesize the findings from all those different methods that have been applied to understand how different activities or components of the project are going to affect specific components of the environment. So in matrices, we are showing these cause-effect relationships that I was illustrating before with the cause-effect diagrams. And we are going to indicate, for instance, in the rows, what are the components of the environment, and then on the columns, what are those specific activities or works of the project that interact with them. The most common matrix that is used in impact assessment is called the Leopold Impact Assessment Matrix. and was created to show precisely these interactions between the project and the environment. The Leopold matrix indicates two different values in each cell. One of them is the magnitude, which is like severity of the impact that is expected to occur. And the other one is the importance of that particular component. In this case, they are marked also with numerical values. The way to use matrices varies. Some practitioners use qualitative values in the cells that could be from null, which means no impact, up to low, medium, and high, or very high. In some cases, there is an arbitrary scale that goes, for instance, from -5, 0 to +5, just to give the idea of different magnitudes that are expected, and then the negative values could be for impacts, the positive values for the benefits. If you check the resources on eCampus, there are some slides, extra slides, and there you can see some examples of matrices that are used in different projects. Another tool that can be used is multi-criteria analysis. And this is useful, for example, when there is assessment of different alternatives to compare those alternatives based on specific objectives that want to be achieved that then are considered as criteria. And then multi-criteria is also very useful to integrate, for instance, the perceptions from different groups to try to get to a consensus of, for instance, how to rank different components of the environment or different impacts. So it's very useful, especially when the stakeholders are involved in the impact assessment process, to have a little more objective way to weight all these different interests that different groups might have. So lastly, I just want to mention that public participation covers a wide range of methods and tools to communicate information to the public and also to get information from the public or the stakeholders. The International Association for Public Participation, IAP2, has published what it calls the spectrum of public participation that comes from informing people about a project to consulting how this project or intervention might benefit them or affect them, or for instance, to involve them in the analysis of the impacts. It could be to collaborate, for example, when deciding what are the best mitigations for specific impacts, and even to empower. That is when the public or stakeholders are given the authority to even design the project by themselves. But in several countries, especially in developing countries, public participation might be very limited, and mainly to inform or consult. So with this, I finished the second presentation. And in the last presentation, we will see how is the determination of the significance of impacts. To conclude this lecture, I want to highlight some points. The assessment for an hydropower project depends very often on the projected capacity because it says the requirements for a thorough or not thorough environmental and social impact assessment. The boundaries of the assessment always should consider an area in which all the direct, indirect, and any other impacts, for example, transboundary, might be experienced on the short and long term. And that requires also setting adequate time boundaries for the assessment. This needs to be larger than the expected life of the project. Very often, the best way to avoid impacts is considering alternatives. This could be, for example, placing the project in other locations where the environment is less sensitive, or modifying dimensions to probably reduce a little bit the production to a level that is still desirable, but to reduce also impacts in social or environmental components. Any project might be very complex. Therefore, the methods to use will depend on the characteristics of the project, all the potentially affected natural and social elements, and the area that is expected to be affected. Public assessments and public participation are also an important part of the impact assessment process. Therefore, the involvement of all the stakeholders, especially those potentially affected, is essential, not only during the analysis of impacts, but also could be through all these steps, from the scoping to design the terms of the assessment, up to the revision, the decision, and the follow-up on the mitigation measures.